Robert Monroe was lying on the couch in his Virginia home, his head pointing toward magnetic north, when he felt the first vibrations in 1958. He wasn't a mystic seeking enlightenment. He was a 43-year-old businessman, the owner of a radio station network, and a pilot with hundreds of hours of flight time. The vibrations began after weeks of experimentation with sound patterns for sleep learning. The phenomenon arrived like lightning coursing through his body from head to toe, a living electrical current that paralyzed his muscles while his consciousness remained alert. On the 9th occurrence, Monroe decided not to resist. That's when it happened. His hand passed through the floor, then his entire arm. He could feel the water in the plumbing, the structural beams, and every material layer of the house. 3 weeks later, floating against the ceiling, Monroe observed his own body sleeping next to his wife. He tested his lucidity. He could read the clock, identify every piece of furniture, and process complex thoughts. He returned to his body. He checked the physical clock. The time matched exactly. Do you understand what this means? If consciousness functions perfectly outside the brain, then the brain doesn't produce consciousness. It only transmits it while you're focused on the physical. Monroe documented 589 experiences in 3 years. He developed verification protocols. He would visit friends out of body, observe specific events, and confirm them later by phone. He mapped consistent territories that he called Locale 1, 2, and 3. The second territory, Locale 2, corresponds to what theoretical physics calls the fifth dimension, a continuum where thought and energy merge instantaneously, where time doesn't flow linearly, and where beings without physical bodies maintain identity and purpose. The technology that Monroe would create to induce these states would change everything, including the interest of certain government agencies in mapping dimensions that officially don't exist. Monroe discovered that vibrations precede every conscious exit from the body. They come in rhythmic waves, starting at the base of the brain and traveling through the entire body like a gentle but penetrating electrical current. The frequency varies between 10 and 40 cycles per second, below normal auditory perception, but clearly sensible as pulsing energy passing through every cell. You feel these same vibrations every night, but your consciousness is already detuning when they begin. During the REM stage of sleep, approximately 90 minutes after falling asleep, your etheric body partially separates from the physical. Monroe identified this process by observing hundreds of people sleeping in the sleep laboratory he set up at Whistlefield Farm. The brainwave patterns changed dramatically at the moment of separation, dominant theta with bursts of even lower frequencies that conventional instruments can't categorize. The second body has its own density, a form identical to the physical but composed of energy in a different state. Monroe weighed volunteers before and during out-of-body experiences using precision scales. He consistently recorded a reduction of 2.5 to 3 ounces during complete separation. When you're in this second body, your hands can pass through solid matter or, with intentional concentration, touch and move physical objects. Vision works in all directions simultaneously. You perceive the environment in a complete sphere, not through 2 focal points as physical eyes limit. Why don't conventional medical instruments detect this separation? Monroe worked with technicians from Laurel State Hospital, testing EEG, ECG, and skin galvanometers. During his verified out-of-body exits, where he visited distant locations and described events confirmed later, the instruments showed only deep relaxation. The energy of the second body vibrates in an octave beyond measurable physical matter, like trying to photograph radio waves with a regular camera. The process of going out of phase works through progressive desynchronization between the frequencies of the physical body and the energy body. Imagine two pendulums swinging in perfect synchrony. Gradually, one begins to oscillate at a slightly different frequency until one is completely out of phase. At that point, they occupy the same space but no longer interact directly. Monroe discovered that you can deliberately induce this desynchronization through rhythmic breathing, visualization of the energy body separating, or through the specific sound patterns that he would develop later. Charles Tart, a psychologist from the University of California, documented the case of Miss Z in a controlled laboratory. She floated out of her body and correctly read a 5-digit number placed on a shelf above her head, impossible to see from the bed where she was connected to electrodes. The study was published in the Journal of the American Society for Psychical Research. Carlos Osis and Janet Mitchell conducted 197 experiments at the American Society for Psychical Research, where out-of-body participants identified targets in distant rooms with statistical precision that rules out coincidence. 1 in 4 adults has already experienced at least one spontaneous conscious separation, according to research by Celia Green from the Institute of Psychophysical Research at Oxford. It usually occurs during surgeries, childbirth, and accidents, moments when the physical system enters extreme stress and consciousness ejects as a preservation mechanism. Do you know someone who saw their body from above during a medical emergency, who observed doctors working while floating on the ceiling? These people didn't hallucinate. They experience the natural state of consciousness when it's not trapped in physical density. The nighttime separation during deep sleep serves specific functions that Monroe catalogued through direct observation. The energy body absorbs what he called locale-2 energy, a nutritive substance that doesn't exist in the physical spectrum but sustains the subtle bodies. Without this nightly recharge, you would experience chronic fatigue that no physical rest would relieve. Information processed during the day is reorganized into patterns that the physical brain alone couldn't structure. That's why creative insights frequently emerge after sleep. The brain doesn't create consciousness, it only anchors and translates it while you operate in the physical world. Monroe demonstrated this by visiting people in comas who were perfectly conscious outside their bodies, observing relatives, hearing conversations, but unable to reconnect with the damaged brain to communicate. When some of these patients recovered, they confirmed in detail what Monroe had perceived about their state, proving that consciousness remains intact, independent of brain function. When Monroe experienced his first conscious separation, the terror was so intense that he immediately sought a medical explanation. Monroe's first thought when he found himself floating was, "I'm having a stroke." The second, "I'm going to die." He forced the return to his body with the desperation of a cornered animal, his heart racing when he reconnected with the physical. His hands were shaking uncontrollably. Cold sweat covered every inch of skin. You've been conditioned since birth to believe that consciousness equals neuronal activity. When that equation breaks, when you find yourself thinking, perceiving, and existing fully while observing your brain meters below, the panic isn't psychological, it's existential. Every structure of reality that sustained your sanity crumbles in seconds. Monroe did what any rational executive from the 1950s would do. He sought a doctor, then another, then a psychiatrist. Blood tests, electroencephalograms, and skull x-rays are used to look for tumors. Dr. Gordon Birch, a respected neurologist from Charlottesville, examined Monroe 3 times. All results normal. The psychiatrist, Dr. Foster Bradshaw, conducted 6 exploratory sessions. Conclusion: no sign of psychosis or pathological dissociation. But the vibrations kept coming. The separations happened 2 or 3 times a week. Monroe started a detailed journal, date, time, duration, atmospheric conditions, emotional state, and every detail of the experience. Patterns emerged. The vibrations came more intensely when he lay with his head pointing toward magnetic north. Separation happened more easily between 3 and 5 in the morning. Extreme emotional states, anger, fear, and sexual excitement prevented the exit. The decisive moment came when Monroe decided to objectively test his out-of-body perceptions. He visited a friend's office, observed specific documents on the desk, returned to his body and called, describing what he'd seen. The friend confirmed every detail, the position of the papers, the content of an open letter, even the half-empty coffee mug. Monroe repeated this type of verification dozens of times. The evidence was incontestable. He was perceiving real information from distant locations while his body remained at home. Why does this discovery terrify so much? You've spent your entire life identifying with your body. When children say, "my body," we correct them to "I." When someone dies, we say they've gone, but the body is there in front of us. Our language betrays the intuitive knowledge we consciously deny. You have a body, you are not a body. Monroe faced fierce resistance from his own rational mind. Even while repeatedly verifying his out-of-body perceptions, part of him insisted on looking for conventional explanations. Telepathy, but how to explain the aerial perspective, the ability to pass through walls and to see in all directions, elaborate hallucination. The details confirmed by third parties destroyed that hypothesis. 6 months after the first experience, Monroe still struggled against the reality of the phenomenon. That's when he found the book The Projection of the Astral Body by Sylvan Muldoon and Howard Carrington in the Charlottesville Library. Muldoon described experiences identical to his, the vibrations, the paralysis, the separation, even specific details like the difficulty reading texts in the out-of-body state due to consciousness fluctuation. Monroe wasn't alone. He wasn't crazy. The transformation from skeptical executive to consciousness explorer took a full year. Monroe established rigorous protocols. Never accept an out-of-body perception without independent verification. Document each experience immediately upon returning. Look for replicable patterns and test limits and capabilities systematically. He approached the phenomenon like an engineer dismantling an unknown machine, without mysticism, without prior beliefs, just methodical observation. Do you understand what it means to begin this journey at 43 years old? Monroe wasn't an impressionable youngster looking for meaning. He was an established, successful man with a reputation to lose. Every time he told someone about his experiences, he risked being considered mentally unstable. But the truth of what he was living was stronger than the fear of social judgment. The psychological process of accepting the out-of-body experience resembles the stages of grief described by Kubler-Ross. Initial denial, anger against the rupture of known reality, bargaining, trying to fit the phenomenon into accepted paradigms, depression upon realizing that life will never be the same, and finally acceptance, not resigned but active, transforming the unknown into territory to be mapped. With acceptance, Monroe began the systematic mapping of 3 completely distinct environments that human consciousness can access. Monroe identified 3 distinct territories accessible through conscious projection. He called them simply Locale 1, Locale 2, and Locale 3, deliberately technical nomenclature, devoid of mystical or religious connotations. Locale I is our physical world perceived without the limitations of bodily senses. When you navigate this environment outside the body, you witness the same material reality, but with radically expanded perception. Monroe discovered he could simultaneously perceive the interior and exterior of objects, see through solid matter by adjusting his focus, and detect energy fields invisible to the physical eye. During a visit to a physicist friend's laboratory, he observed the magnetic field around an electromagnet, He described it as luminous purple-blue tentacles pulsing in spiral patterns. The friend confirmed that the equipment was calibrated at exactly the frequency and power that would produce the pattern described. In locale 1, consciousness can travel instantly to any point on the planet by thinking of the destination. Monroe visited his daughter's hotel room in San Francisco while his body remained in Virginia. He described the furniture arrangement, the color of the bedspread, and a specific book on the nightstand. She confirmed every detail by phone the next morning, including that she had changed rooms that afternoon, explaining why the description didn't match her original accommodations. Locale 2 operates under completely different laws. It's the fifth dimension proper, a continuum where thought and substance are identical. When you think of a form, it materializes instantly around you. Monroe discovered this accidentally when, floating in this environment, he thought about being in a park. Immediately, trees, grass, and benches appeared, constructed from a luminous, malleable substance that responded to every mental nuance. Time in Locale 2 doesn't flow linearly. Monroe encountered people who had died decades before and others who would die years later, all coexisting in the same expanded now. He participated in a meeting where a man named B.B. showed him events from his own future life, including the construction of the Monroe Institute, which would only happen 15 years later. When these events materialized exactly as observed, Monroe understood that in Locale 2, you access what quantum physics calls the field of collapse probabilities, all moments existing simultaneously. The inhabitants of Locale 2 maintain humanoid form by habit, not necessity. Monroe observed beings consciously changing appearance, some presenting themselves as pulsing spheres of light, others maintaining the appearance they had in life. Communication happens through direct transmission of complete blocks of knowledge, what he called rotes. In a fraction of a second, you receive information that would take hours to verbalize. It's like an instant download of a compressed file that expands in your consciousness. Each belief system creates its own territory in Locale 2. Monroe visited what devoted Catholics experience as heaven, cathedrals of light, angelic choirs, and the comforting presence of saints and the Virgin Mary. He explored the territory of convinced materialists, a replica of the physical world where they continue denying their dead, creating elaborate explanations for obvious anomalies. He witnessed the void of nihilists, a grey space where nothing happens because they believe nothing exists after death. Locale 3 revealed itself as the most intriguing, a complete physical world, but divergent from ours. Monroe found himself in a different body, taller, thinner, with 6 fingers on each hand. The technology was mechanical and chemical, not electrical. Steam-powered vehicles navigated on magnetic rails. The architecture followed acoustic principles, buildings shaped like spiral shells that amplified and directed sound. In this world, Monroe had another complete identity, childhood memories, a profession as an acoustic architect, and family. He discovered historical records showing that the divergence with our timeline occurred in the 18th century when the Industrial Revolution took a different direction. Benjamin Franklin never experimented with electricity in that reality. Instead, a scientist named Helmut Bronner developed propulsion based on sonic resonance. Monroe methodically mapped routes between these locales. He discovered that specific angles of exit from the body determined the destination. Rolling out of the body led to Locale I. Rising vertically with the intention of going to the most appropriate place led to Locale II. Locale III required a peculiar twist, like turning 90 degrees in a direction that doesn't exist in 3-dimensional space. Later, he would develop a more precise numerical system, focus levels, marking states of consciousness like coordinates on a multidimensional map. Focus 1 is physical waking consciousness. Focus 10, body asleep, mind awake. Focus 15, beyond time. Focus 21, the bridge to other energy systems. Each level vibrates at a specific frequency, and Monroe discovered that conscious beings permanently inhabit these territories. Monroe discovered that navigating between dimensions requires the same type of precision as tuning radio frequencies. At first, you spin the dial randomly, catching static fragments of transmissions, until you learn the exact frequencies of each station. Consciousness works on an identical principle. Each vibrational state gives access to a specific territory of the multidimensional continuum. The first beings that Monroe encountered in Locale 2 communicated through what he called NVC, nonverbal communication. A being who identified himself as BB instantly transmitted to him an entire consciousness navigation system. They weren't words or images. It was sudden and complete understanding, as if the knowledge had always been there and only now became accessible. In 2 seconds, Monroe received the equivalent of a 300-page technical manual on interdimensional movement. BB revealed something fundamental. Some beings choose to reincarnate repeatedly in the physical world, others consider a single life sufficient, and others have never experienced material density. Earth functions as a high-intensity school. Physical limitations, birth amnesia, and the struggle for survival create accelerated evolutionary pressure. You learn more about consciousness in 70 years here than in millennia in Locale 2, where thought manifests reality instantly. Monroe mapped a natural hierarchy based on experience rather than moral judgment. He encountered beings he called inspectors, ancient consciousnesses that never incarnated but study human experience with scientific fascination. He observed helpers, recently disincarnate people who choose to remain close to the physical plane to assist the living in critical moments. He documented the sleepers, millions of consciousnesses who die without knowing they died, wandering in mental replicas of their familiar environments. The level that Monroe designated Focus 27 functions as a grand consciousness transport terminal. He observed structures that seemed built from crystallized light, reception pavilions where newcomers from the physical world recover memories of previous existences, libraries containing records of all human experiences, and what he called planning centers, where beings program future incarnations with specific learning objectives. At this level, Monroe reunited with his father, who had died years earlier. The communication was instantaneous. His father transmitted his entire post-death experience in a single rote. He had spent considerable time in what he believed was Christian heaven until he perceived the limitations of that collective mental construction. Now, he was assisting other family members in transition, preparing them before they left the physical. Monroe verified. 3 months later, his aunt died peacefully, reporting to the nurse that Robert Sr. was waiting for her. The most disturbing discovery: living beings can perform specific work at these levels. Monroe began what he called rescue work, locating consciousnesses trapped in level 23, the purgatory of the confused, and guiding them to appropriate areas. In one documented operation, he found victims of a recent plane crash. They were obsessively recreating the final moments of the flight, trapped in a loop of terror. Monroe and other retrievers transmitted calm, explained the situation, and led them to Focus 27. Why can living people do this work better than beings permanently in Locale 2? Monroe discovered that maintaining a connection with the physical body creates a unique vibrational bridge. You resonate simultaneously with material density and the subtle planes, facilitating communication with consciousnesses still attached to the physical world. It's like being a bilingual translator between two cultures that barely understand each other. The most evolved beings that Monroe encountered maintained no form at all. They existed as pure consciousness, capable of assuming any appearance necessary for communication. One of them, identifying through an untranslatable concept that Monroe approximated as inspec, demonstrated the illusory nature of separate individuality. He temporarily merged his consciousness with Monroe's. For moments, he experienced perception of hundreds of simultaneous lives, each thinking itself unique and isolated, all being facets of the same greater being. The organization of these planes follows impeccable logic. Similar consciousnesses attract magnetically. You naturally gravitate to the level corresponding to your state of development. There's no external judgment determining your post-death destiny. Your own consciousness frequency determines where you tune in. Monroe observed murderers and saints at the same level when they shared an identical degree of self-awareness, while good but unconscious people remained at lower levels. This natural organization follows precise laws. Consciousnesses aggregate by vibrational resonance, creating the architecture of the non-physical planes. The non-physical worlds organize themselves through pure vibrational resonance. Monroe discovered that consciousnesses vibrating at similar frequencies naturally aggregate, forming distinct territories and locale too. Like oil drops on a water surface, each consciousness group creates its own reality bubble, maintained by the collective mental energy of its inhabitants. Focus 23 represents the vibrational band closest to the physical world. Monroe found millions of consciousnesses trapped at this level. People who died in sudden accidents, overdose victims, suicides in shock, and elderly people with severe dementia. They obsessively recreate familiar environments, hospitals where they believe they're recovering, homes where they wait for family members who never arrive, accidents they relive infinitely. A man dead since 1942 was still waiting for the train to Chicago, checking a broken watch, without realizing that 7 decades had passed. Just above, levels 24 to 26 house collective religious constructions. Monroe systematically explored these territories. In Focus 25, he found the Catholic heaven, not metaphor or symbol, but a literal structure built by centuries of concentrated faith. Cathedrals of golden energy where millions of faithful experience exactly the paradise they expected. Angelic choirs singing in Latin, the comforting presence of specific saints, and eternal gardens where families reunite. The Virgin Mary appears regularly, not the historical person, but a collective thought form fed by billions of prayers. In Focus 26, Monroe discovered the Eastern Paradises, Buddhist monks meditating in floating monasteries, each convinced of having reached nirvana. Hindus experiencing the lokas described in the Vedas, complete with dancing deities and rivers of Amrita. Muslims in gardens with crystalline fountains and Hur al-Ain, exactly as the Quran describes. Each group is isolated in its belief bubble, without realizing that other paradises exist meters away vibrationally. Do you understand what this reveals? These paradises are real. Conscious people inhabit them, experience genuine happiness, and meet loved ones. But they are also self-imposed prisons. Monroe observed the moment when some consciousnesses perceived the limitations. A Catholic priest from the 12th century suddenly questioned why only Catholics arrived there. A Muslim child asked where her Christian friends from school were. These doubts create fissures in the mental construction. The consciousness begins to vibrate at a different frequency and naturally ascends to Focus 27. Focus 27 Monroe called the Park, a neutral territory beyond religious or cultural constructions. Here exist the structures he called Reception Center, Rehabilitation Center, and Education Center. They aren't physical buildings, but organized fields of consciousness energy. In the Education Center, beings access what Monroe called total knowledge available, all knowledge accumulated by humanity available instantly. You simply focus on a question, and complete understanding flows into your consciousness. It was in Focus 27 that Monroe witnessed what he called the gathering. Beings from throughout the universe are converging to observe a rare event, Earth's transition from one state of consciousness to another. He perceived representatives from star systems that even our astronomy hasn't detected, life forms based on principles completely different from carbon biology, intelligences that evolved beyond the need for form. All are observing our small planet with intense interest. Why? Monroe received the answer through a massive rote from the being inspec. The human experience on Earth produces something unique in the universe, what he translated as louche. When you face physical limitation, pain, separation, and fear of death, your consciousness generates a refined form of emotional energy. This energy, purified through suffering and transcendence, feeds levels of existence we can't conceive. We aren't victims being milked by superior beings. We're voluntary participants in a cosmic system of energy transformation. The closer to Earth in terms of vibrational frequency, the more Monroe encountered what he called M-band noise, millions of human thoughts creating mental cacophony. Fears, desires, obsessions, sexual fantasies, anger, all raw human emotions forming a dense cloud around the planet. As he ascended vibrationally, this noise diminished to the crystalline silence of the higher levels where pure consciousness operates without emotional distortion. Monroe encountered humans from the future operating at these higher levels. They weren't aliens, they were our descendants who had transcended the need for physical bodies but maintained essential human identity. They explained that humanity's current phase, with all its violence and confusion, is a necessary stage. Like the caterpillar, which must completely dissolve in the chrysalis before emerging as a butterfly, humanity is undergoing a necessary decomposition of old structures before consciousness metamorphoses. Monroe transformed these discoveries into reproducible technology through hemisync, attracting the attention of American military agencies. Monroe discovered that sounds could induce body separation while experimenting with recordings for sleep learning in his studio. When different frequencies play in each ear, the brain produces a third tone that doesn't exist in the air. It arises only inside your head. This phantom tone vibrates at the same frequency as the states of consciousness Monroe had manually mapped over years of exploration. The principle is elegant. Your consciousness resonates with specific frequencies in each state. Awake, you vibrate in one range. Sleeping, in another. Out of body, in a third. Monroe discovered he could guide consciousness through these states using precise combinations of tones. He named the technology hemisync, hemispheric synchronization, because the two sides of the brain, normally operating at different frequencies, enter into coherence. The American government had been observing Monroe for years. Since 1972, the CIA had been investigating reports that the Soviets were training psychic spies. The fear wasn't mystical, it was strategic. If consciousness could operate independently of the body, traditional espionage would become obsolete. There was no defense against the observer who passed through walls without leaving traces. The Army Intelligence and Security Command sent its best officers to the Monroe Institute. Joe McMonigal, a decorated military man, discovered during training that he could describe the interior of Soviet installations he had never visited. Skip Atwater, an intelligence captain, learned to leave his body and locate missing persons. These weren't hippies looking for enlightenment. They were professional soldiers applying consciousness technology for national security. The CIA document on the Gateway process reveals the depth of governmental interest. The military analyst describes how consciousness, once desynchronized from the body through hemisync, accesses what he calls the universal holographic field, all the information of the universe stored at each point of space-time. You don't travel to the target during remote viewing. You tune into the frequency where that information already exists at your own location, like changing stations on a cosmic radio. McMoneagle executed 150 official remote viewing missions. He located a Soviet bomber that had crashed in Zaire. He described the new Typhoon submarine being built in a closed shipyard. He identified double agents within the CIA itself. The government wouldn't spend millions training hundreds of agents in a fantasy. They were obtaining actionable intelligence through consciousnesses that navigate beyond physical limits. But Monroe perceived a deeper application than espionage. If consciousness survives without the body, death becomes a transition, not a termination. He began taking the technology to hospitals, working with terminal patients. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross participated in the first sessions. Patients in the final stages of cancer, using HemiSync, met dead relatives and received specific guidance about the transition process. Nancy Monroe, diagnosed with metastatic cancer, used her last months to map her post-death destination. She established what she called a memorial in Focus 27, not a physical place, but a vibrational coordinate where she would remain accessible. She described every detail to her husband. After her death, Institute participants began reporting encounters with her at that exact location, without knowing her prior descriptions. She transmitted specific messages that the family confirmed. The Lifeline program teaches ordinary people to perform consciousness rescues. You learn to tune into Focus 23, where millions remain trapped without knowing they died. With training, you can establish communication, explain the situation, and guide them to appropriate levels. Participants document complete names, death dates, and biographical details later verified in public records. Dr. Charles Tart supervised experiments where participants, in acoustically isolated rooms, met in out-of-body states and exchanged predetermined information. The protocols were rigorous, double-blind, randomized, and with statistical analysis. The results showed genuine communication happening beyond known physical channels. Physicists visit the Institute trying to understand the implications. If consciousness operates independently of the brain, all neuroscience needs revision. If information can be accessed non-locally, the nature of spacetime requires a new interpretation. If death is a perceptual illusion, the meaning of human existence is completely transformed. The Institute now functions as a bridge between worlds. Doctors learn to accompany patients in transition. Families prepare to maintain contact after physical death. Scientists explore frontiers of consciousness with methodological rigor. What began as one man's terrifying experience became reproducible technology for navigating dimensions that always existed, waiting only for us to develop the instruments to perceive them. Monroe demonstrated that we are multidimensional beings temporarily focused on a narrow band of perception. The physical body isn't a prison, it's a specialized vehicle for experiences that only material density provides. When you learn to desynchronize your consciousness through specific frequencies, you discover that you have always had access to the entire dimensional spectrum. You could always tune into the fifth dimension, where thought creates reality, where time doesn't flow linearly, and where beings without bodies maintain identity and purpose. Thousands of explorers using Monroe technology report identical encounters in the same non-physical territories. They find the same reception centers in Focus 27. They describe the same religious constructions in levels 24 to 26. They witness the same consciousnesses trapped in level 23. This consistency among thousands of independent reports establishes that these territories exist objectively, not as individual constructions, but as the real geography of consciousness. Military validation transformed mystical experience into operational technology. When intelligence agencies invest millions in training spies to navigate non-physical dimensions, when decorated officers receive medals for remote viewing missions, when classified documents confirm access to information beyond the five senses, you understand that this transcends belief or philosophy. It's a natural human capability that our culture has simply forgotten how to access. Monroe left us more than techniques. He left a map. Now we know what to expect after permanently leaving the body. We know the levels, the challenges, and the opportunities. We can consciously prepare for the greatest transition of existence. We can maintain communication with those who have departed. We can assist those trapped between worlds. Every change begins with understanding your role as co-creator, and the only way to connect with this divine intelligence is through meditation.